Hello, my name is Doug Guthrie, and I'm a professor of global management and executive director of China initiatives at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. I'm also the co-founder and chairman of On Global Leadership. At On Global Leadership, we invite organizations and individuals to think of new ways of thinking about leadership development, geopolitical economics, and smart capitalism to propel growth and innovation and opportunity. OGL offers thought leadership through its portal that provides a variety of analyses about leadership, the global economy, and in particular, life in China. Our lens is always a mixture of geopolitical analyses combined with boots on the ground experience. Our work, our research reports, insight posts, podcasts, books, reports, and certain advisory services are mindful of the new ways of thinking about how to move organizations and individuals forward in the 21st century. So in this particular post, what I'd like to do is I'd like to convey some ideas that I delivered to the Greater Phoenix business community. So Greater Phoenix Leadership is an organization that brings together all of the top businesses in the Greater Phoenix area. And recently I was invited to give a talk at their annual retreat. They don't call them retreats, they call them advances. To give a talk at their annual advance to discuss the geopolitical situation that we're in the world today. And so I was asked to talk about China. The title of the talk is The Rise of China with Opportunities for the United States with Focus on Greater Phoenix. And so I prepared that talk and was paired with another individual who was there to talk about domestic politics. And so we sat through the meeting and were asked to the stage to give our talk. And so I thought I would, while that talk was a private discussion, so it wasn't filmed that we could produce the link directly for OGL, I thought I would convey the ideas that I gave in that discussion and post them here on our site. So allow me to share my screen and let's dive into what we're talking about in this discussion. So here we are. And let me dive into this conversation. So on global leadership, China's rise and opportunities for economic development in the United States with focus on Greater Phoenix. Again, I'm Doug Guthrie, and happy to be here with you and convey some of these ideas. First, I'd like to just start out with, for me, some of you who have watched me before and been following on global leadership, you may know this, but for those who are new to our discussions and environment, let me just say a few words about myself. I grew up starting at about 18 years old. I developed an obsession with China. I took my first Chinese language course as a sophomore at the University of Chicago. And I fell in love with the language. And that happened to be the time of the Tiananmen uprising. And I just was captivated by Chinese language, literature, and history, but also with the economic development that was occurring there. And I really wanted to develop a way of thinking about what we were doing in the world today and what the economic development opportunities were. And the Tiananmen movement happened in the spring of 1989, and I was just captivated. I was there watching kids my own age staring down tanks, fighting for democracy. And so I took a year off school, went to live in Taiwan, and came back having been immersed in the language and just decided I'm not just going to be an economics major. That's what all kids do at the University of Chicago. I'm going to be a Chinese language, literature, and history major. And sure, I'm interested in economics, but that'll be a side hobby. And then I went to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, and I just couldn't get the Tiananmen movement out of my mind. So I had to study economic sociology, which was a nice middle ground between the hardcore economics of neoclassical economic theory a la Chicago, and the more sort of gentle approach to what we call a sociological imagination. How do we really think deeply about what's happening in the global economy today in society and among people? And so, that was sort of my story. I became a professor at the New York University, did some work, wrote some books. Dragon in a Three-Piece Suit, The Emergence of Capitalism in China was my first book. Followed that with books on social connections in China, which was an edited volume on Guanxi, and then China and Globalization. It was a book that was sort of more general than the technical academic books that I did. I was also very proud at that time because I was a young assistant professor in the mid to late 1990s, and there I was being invited to Washington to um, help argue for getting China into the World Trade Organization, which eventually we did. And China was granted entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. So that was my first mixture of doing academic work and policy work. And I sort of caught the bug at that time. And I went on to continue my work in the business school at NYU. I directed executive education there and then became a dean at the George Washington University School of Business. And there I was really kind of extending outward beyond just being an academic and an academic administrator. I was very interested in thinking about how do we tie what we know about economic development in places like China to economic development in places like Washington, D.C. So I formed a close relationship with the mayor's office. At that time, it was Mayor Vincent Gray and Victor Hoskins, who became a dear friend and close collaborator, was the deputy mayor for planning and economic development. And he and I, and together with two members of the On Global Leadership team, Sarah Kellogg and John McKeel, we all worked together to build a strategic economic plan. We did the 5-year strategic economic plan for the city with real economic impact analysis of what was going on in the city and what the plans were, but also with how to think about DC being a global city. So we used our China knowledge for that kind of work. And then one of the things that happened after my time as a dean at George Washington, after I left that post, I went to work for Apple. And this was my sort of time away from academia, what they call in Chinese Shanghai, which means to come out of the highland of academia and come down into the real world places. And so I became an executive. I was the head of Apple University in China, and I was part of my job was leadership development for Apple employees, but also I was there because I was a China scholar and a China expert. And President Xi Jinping was new to his position. He was inaugurated in March of 2013, and I joined the company in 2014. And it was an interesting and important time to really evaluate what was happening in China and what we needed to do to really deeply understand the transformation of Chinese society. And so, again, for On Global Leadership, we thought a lot about how to develop these approaches to doing work in these areas. And our mission is to be the premier institution on thought leadership research, teaching, and advisory work in key areas that shape the global political economy today. And we focus on China, but we also focus on a number of other things that are kind of key to the ways in which economic development occurs. So a couple of key things. When I do my lectures on China, I like to start here. We often like to think of China's rise. And I always emphasize to whether I'm teaching students or teaching executives or advising the Tim Cooks of the world, I like to emphasize 3 things. First, history and culture matter. History and culture matter. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to talk about 2,000-year-old history today, but it matters in terms of the Chinese mindset. And even for some of the things that we're going to talk about today, it matters. And so it's always important to be present and to be thinking about history and culture. It's also crucial that we often make the mistake of thinking of China as some unified geopolitical entity. And it is a unified country, including places like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan. But to mistakenly think about it just as China and not think about it as a complex political entity with local political economies. There are 31 provincial level units. There are many tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities. Usually people know the tier 1 cities, the Shanghais, Beijings, Chongqings, Chengdu's of the world. But often people don't know the 2nd and 3rd tier cities, and this is really where the action is in China. So we always encourage people to go deep. And similarly, when I was at Apple, I often do my professor getting upset and annoyed thing when people aren't as knowledgeable as you want them to be. But I remember when I got there, I was asking the leadership, so who's in head of government affairs here? And like, what are we doing to build the bridges with the Shanghai government? And they were like, well, we have a government affairs office. They sit in Beijing. And I sort of rolled my eyes and said, This is exactly the problem. You guys are the single largest foreign investor in China in the world, and I'm sure you think you need to be in Beijing, and you do. But your headquarters are in Shanghai. Your headquarters are in Pudong in Shanghai. Who has a relationship with the mayor of the district of Pudong? And I was sort of at some point speaking a language that was unclear to people. And I was, this is one of the mistakes that many companies, not just Apple, make, is that you need to understand the local political economy. And finally, you need to understand the giant geopolitical issues. Apple and China are closely tied in an area that's really important. China is the manufacturer for the world. And a lot of companies like Apple and Tesla and others are deeply embedded there. But that's not all China is. China is also the most populous, well, now it's the second most populous nation on earth with 1.4 billion people. It's the second largest economy on the planet. Soon to be the largest economy on the planet if growth trajectories and if OGL's predictions go forward. And China wants a seat at the table. It's deeply offensive to many Chinese leaders that China's not a member of the G7. Now, members of the G7 would say, well, that's because it was set up to be democratic capitalist economies that we're talking about economic development in the world. Well, we know that's not true because Russia was let into the G7 and it was transformed into the G8 in 2008. Now, Russia was kicked out in 2014 because of the invasion of Crimea, but to China and to Chinese leaders like Xi Jinping, it's deeply offensive. And they are relegated to what I often refer to as the kids' table, the G20. And so treating China with respect in a geopolitical sense is really, really important. And so that's another thing that I like to emphasize. And all of our approaches to how we teach at OGL take this approach to doing work. Now, what about China's rise? Well, you could talk about 2,000 years ago. You could talk about 200 years ago. I like to talk about 1994. It's a little bit narcissistic, but this is where China begins for me. I, was studying history and wrote my undergraduate thesis on the last Qing emperor, Yuan Shikai. But really where China begins for me is the first trip I took to China as a graduate student doing my doctoral dissertation research in 1994. And this, I would look across, I would stand on the Bund, which is the westernized part of Shanghai along the Huangpu River, and I would look out across and see the one building that existed in Lujiazui, which is a Shanghai TV tower. And we all were told that this place was going to boom and it would be totally different in 20 years, but well, okay, we'll see. And the comparisons were made between the underdeveloped Shanghai, and Shanghai was supposed to be the opening to China, the mouth of China, as it's often called, and comparing that to New York City just it didn't seem like we were in the same league. And this is, of course, what companies like Apple were doing back then. But this is what it looked like 25 years later. 3 of the top 20 tallest buildings in the world all sitting within 1 block of each other. The Shanghai TV tower is still there, but so are many other buildings. And so just kind of thinking through that economic transformation was a dramatic thing to withhold. And it's also, a place where many companies have developed along the way as well. So how did we get here? We're talking about China's rise in this talk. So how did we get here? Well, let's dig in. We're going to really go through this, and I'm not going to go deep into history because I want to keep this relatively compact and short. And this is a 40-minute talk for a group of restless executives who are leaders in the greater Phoenix area. So I'm going to go fast, and I'm not going to go deep into history, but believe me, at OGL, we love to go into history. And so if you're ever interested in hearing more about this, we have plenty of podcasts and posts and recordings that can help you get deeper. But really, to start this, we don't go back to 1994. We go a little bit further back to 1979. 1979, China had been through just a disastrous period. Starting in 1839 was the beginning of what China would call the century of humiliation. So 1839 was the first Opium War, the second Opium War in 1849, and then the Sino-Japanese War in 1897, and then the fall of the Imperial China in World War I and World War II, and the rape of Nanking. And then with Mao coming to power in 1949, the Communist Revolution being victorious, it was sort of thought like, wow, now we're here and we're going to transform the world. Um, and it was still a disastrous time. I mean, under Mao's policies, the Great Leap Forward, 50 million people died of starvation in the early 1950s. I mean, think about that number, 50 million. It's amazing to think about. And so just kind of walking through that period, and then you have the Cultural Revolution. Finally, Mao dies in 1979, and Deng Xiaoping comes to power in Mao died in 1976, and Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1979. And this was really the birth of the new China. This is what we called opening up. And Deng Xiaoping gets on a plane in early 1979, flies to meet Jimmy Carter. He goes to a rodeo. He goes to a John Denver concert. He also visited three cities in addition to Washington. In Washington, he signed the Normalization Agreement, which normalized U.S. China relations. And by the way, conceded during that time that Taiwan was a part of China, even though there was this complex relationship because the nationalists were still occupying Taiwan. But he went to three different cities, which I always think is interesting to think about just how far ahead this young leader who was raised in communism was thinking. He went to Atlanta. Why? Well, because if you want to build a prosperous economy, you better understand consumer behavior. And who should you invite to China but Coca-Cola? Why did he go to Seattle? Well, if you want to have a strong economy, you can't just think about consumer behavior and buying Coca-Cola. You need to think about complex manufacturing and building supply chains that could manufacturing things like airplanes. So we should go visit Boeing, and Boeing and Coke became the first two companies to enter China under China's new joint venture law that was passed in early 1979. And then why Houston? Well, let's dream big. We're not just going to be selling Coke and building airplanes. We're going to be launching rockets. We're going to be going up into space. And so, this was a really big time for China to begin the economic reforms and to dream big. And, it was in this time period that Deng Xiaoping became Times Man of the Year, and he launched China in an important direction. And, some 30 years later, we would see China's, what I like to refer to it as coming out party, in which the 2008 Olympics were just launched to such amazing fanfare. And during that time, the early 2000s, there was a lot of debate about, oh my goodness, is China going to be a mess? Is it going to work? And, maybe we should pull the Olympics and put them somewhere else. And China did fine. I mean, it was an amazing event. It was very Chinese. Initially, they had Steven Spielberg there to be the director of the event. And they decided, no, we shouldn't do that. We should have a Chinese director. So they hired Zhang Yimou, who was the director of my favorite Chinese movie, To Live. And he came and just gave a beautiful show. Now, how did we get here economically, where we are today? I like to think of China's economic development is divided into epochs that are loosely tied to the leaders. Under Deng Xiaoping, the 1980s, we saw just the opening of China. China needed cash to flow in. It had 800 million people living in abject poverty, and we needed to put those people to work, and it was cheap labor for the world. And so China began to see resources pour in and began to see an influence of foreign investment pouring in that would transform China. We would also see localization during this time period. And then in addition to really kind of thinking through the different periods, we have the 1990s under Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin. And Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin were very much attracting foreign investment for economic development that would require companies to develop a capitalist approach to the economic development period. And we would see in this time period a lot of joint ventures and a lot of technology transfer. And then under China enters the WTO in 2001, it becomes illegal to have a quid pro quo for market access. And then under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, things would become much more open. That's actually when Apple entered China, by the way. And then President Xi comes to power in 2013, and it was very clear from the beginning that there was a different mindset that was going to be struck. And so even though China can't go back to having a quid pro quo for market access, they've been very aggressive at forcing companies that want to operate in China to step up and be very clearly tied to partnering with China, to giving China what it wanted and what it needed. Now, it's important not to just think of these things in macro level issues. There are local level issues too. And again, we all know the Shanghais and the Nanjings of the world. But back then, who knew what Suzhou was? Well, there's a famous Chinese phrase that, Suzhou and Hangzhou are just below heaven and earth. But Suzhou was the end of the Silk Road under Marco Polo. And so it was a little bit famous during that time, but it was a little town. It's a second, third tier city. But Shanghai was getting so expensive in the 1990s that they hired some people from Singapore to come and develop something called the Suzhou Industrial Park. And it became a fascinating place to really think about local economic development. And this is something that OGL specializes in. We always try to take business leaders and politicians much deeper inside of China than just thinking about the Shanghais, Beijings, and Shenzhens of the world. You need to go deep, and you need to know places like Suzhou. And then, of course, China entered the WTO in 2001. And then again, we see Xi Jinping. We see the development of China into a new era in which, even though China was in the WTO and even though it was the second largest economy in the world, there was going to be a much more aggressive stance about China tacking towards becoming the largest economy in the world, but also tacking away from its dependence on just the United States or just the West. And so we see things like Xi's reinvigoration. The Belt and Road Initiative was initially announced in 2008, but under Xi Jinping, it was re-announced. And then anti-corruption campaigns were fostered and put in place in 2013. And then a bunch of new laws were passed that become a very big part of the work that I do. Now, just to go back to my own work, again, Apple enters China in 2001. And, this was the time that China had just entered the WTO. And so it was sort of open market, and you didn't have to have joint ventures to operate in China. And from 2002 to 2010, it was sort of open game. And Tim Cook was the chief operating officer, and he was really the person who knew ops and was sort of Steve Jobs' number two, but Steve focused on product and kind of the marketing of the company, stayed in the United States, and Tim Cook took the company into China. And in my opinion, Tim was brilliant. What he set up in China has created a relationship that has allowed Apple to become the most profitable company in the world. And this new vision kind of continued on until 2013, 2014. But in 2013, it's interrupted by Xi Jinping coming to power, and things really changed. And that was the time that I joined Apple. And, I spent a lot of time working with the executives and talking about Apple in China and developing an understanding of why it was that Apple was so successful. And again, most people think it's because we make the best products in the world. Even Apple executives will say that to you, but it's not. It's because here's my favorite statistic about Apple. Apple controls about 30% of the smartphone market share in the world, yet they take about 93% of the profit in this market segment. Why? How can that be? Well, the reason is because Apple is so engaged with transformative passing of tacit knowledge to their suppliers. And Apple doesn't work with just one supplier. People think like, oh, Foxconn just built a plant in Chennai that now they can make iPhones in Chennai. Foxconn's just final assembly. But what was really happening with China was Apple was working with about 1,600 suppliers. They would all compete against each other for Apple's attention. And so therefore they would be willing to work with Apple for free. And so then they'd use Apple's tacit knowledge about operations and building effective supply chains and turn around and make their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, everyone at Samsung, everybody else in the market. So I spent a lot of time developing an understanding of this and developing an understanding of what lied behind the profitability and the $1 trillion valuation. And, was interviewed with some people to tell that story. But it's a very important story that has really shown just how tied Apple remains to China today. I thought it was very interesting that on the day or the week that the United States Department of Justice launched a suit against Apple, Where was Tim Cook? He was in Shanghai. He was in Shanghai to announce the opening of the new Jing'an store, but also to visit with Shenzhen officials because of the Shenzhen R&D centers. And I felt like it was a signal like, hello, China, hello, President Xi, I'm here and I'm committed to China. We're an American company, but we're very committed to our partnership with China. My own group at On Global Leadership has written a lot about this, and I encourage people to go look at them and find these articles and read them. And we're happy to share more about them, but I won't say more about that today. What I want to just dive into very quickly here is the argument about why. How has this happened? And we believe that there are three keys to reform in China. Um, but first, before I get into the keys to reform, let me give you a little bit of theory. These two enemies on the top are my villains. They're Jeffrey Sachs and Janos Kornai. I talk about them because I'm a big believer that neoclassical economic theory, which is the theory that came out of the University of Chicago, it's just bankrupt. It's a theory that basically argues that markets are the most efficient way of defining economic development, and states should just get out of the way, privatize everything, and let the market do its magic. And it's just a theoretically and in practice bankrupt theory. It's just not the way economies work. My two heroes on the bottom are my advisor, who's on the right. His name is Neil Flickstein, and I think he's one of the greatest minds in academia today. He was a real progenitor behind his mentor, Harrison White, of the field of economic sociology. And just a brilliant, brilliant mind in terms of thinking about how we understand markets and economic development. And he was one of my mentors at the University of California, Berkeley. And then another inspiration for me is an individual named Andy Walder, who brilliant mind and just a China scholar and China specialist, more of a political sociologist than an economic sociologist, but he wrote a brilliant article in 1995 when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, which was called Local Governments as Industrial Firms. And he had an insight that was so transformative for how we understood what China was doing, that it became the inspiration for all of my work for years to follow. So the key point here is Sachs and Kornai argued when they were transforming the Soviet bloc and China was going through its economic transformation that everybody should just privatize everything, let the market do its magic. And the former Soviet bloc and Russia followed that advice, and it was a disaster. It was just an economic disaster. China said, no, we're not doing that. What we're going to do is we are going to move forward with just a gradual approach to transformation. And we're going to build what Walder and Flickstein would call a political culture built around local innovation and local governments as industrial firms. So these two guys, Sachs and Kornai, free markets, shock therapy, neoclassical economic theory. China rejected these instead to focus on first, pragmatism. Deng Xiaoping was famous for saying, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white. What matters is it catches mice. If it catches mice, it's a good cat. Now you might think, why is a leader of China talking about cats and mice? He's not actually talking about cats and mice. He's talking about communism and capitalism. And this is, I think, a remarkable story because, he came to power in a dangerous time, and he was worried that Mao's followers might come grab him and dethrone him if he wasn't careful. But he was basically saying, I don't care about communism or capitalism. What I care about is economic development and putting food in the stomachs of a population of starving people. And so I don't care if it's communism or capitalism, as long as we can catch mice, have economic development and food, it's a system that works for me. So pragmatism. China has also been fundamentally tied to economic development through gradualism. This is another famous Deng Xiaoping saying, 摸着石头过河. So we know on the other end of the riverbank is a successful economy. And we're not sure how we're going to get there. So neoclassical economic theory that says rapid privatization, I don't care. What we're going to do is we're going to move slowly. We're going to tap on this block and this stone and see if it's stable. And then we're going to continue to move forward from there. So gradualism allowed for stability during transitions and experimentation with new institutional forms that were often hidden. And finally, most importantly, China is very decentralized. We often think of these one-party authoritarian systems that are fundamentally tied to a centralized party in Beijing. Not true. That is not what happens in China. Again, I've mentioned this earlier in my slides, but China is a very decentralized system with 31 provincial level units, many tier one, tier two, and tier three cities. Again, most people know about Shanghai and Shenzhen. Very few people know the cities Changzhou and Zhenjiang. Changzhou, if you want to know where the heart of renewable energy and the heart of EV battery technology is, it's in Changzhou, right? So go inland a little bit to Jiangsu province and see what's there. And, again, my team really focuses on tier two and tier three cities and how these cities have they've put control in the hands of local officials who were budget constrained, and competition emerged and a political culture of innovation emerged. And so here we have Walder and Flickstein, local governments as industrial firms, and a political cultural approach to institution building. Neil's book, which is one of the big inspirations in my intellectual work, is called The Architecture of Markets. This book came out, I think, in 2001, but it was what Neil called an economic sociology of 21st century capitalist economies. Recommend it to everybody. But here again, like this is a period in which Xi Jinping was emerging as the most powerful leader since Mao. And there were more and more discussions that used party and Xi Jinping and core thinking. And it was a little bit scary and a little bit dangerous to many people. And here again, we also see the pivot away. Again, the Belt and Road Initiative was officially passed in 2008 or announced in 2008, but under Xi Jinping, it became a much bigger emphasis on pivoting away from dependence on the West. And we see predictions that China's economy, according to China, is going to be the largest economy in the world by 2035. Our OGL team thinks that's right. We'd probably think it's not at the 2027, 28, but we think probably by 2035, it's going to be there. And we have done a lot of research to back that position up. And we see central government guidance and local innovation. And here again, a political culture approach to innovative development. Now, China is often viewed as the Shanghai, the mountain fortress, just copying technology. And sure, there are lots of cases where technology is copied. This one story is always funny to me because, when I got to Apple, I fought hard for Apple. Apple always had their phones would say iPhone, designed by Apple in California, assembled in China, because they didn't want to say made in China. They wanted to emphasize that the smart product people were in California. But, to me and to a lot of Chinese people I knew, this was really offensive. Like, essentially, this was made like, we can design really good things in America, and they're not made in China. They're just assembled in China. And so I fought for about a year, and eventually, the executive team agreed with me, and they took that off the phone. And we started seeing these phones that were still like this. And I went back to the executive team and back to some people and said, "What's going on? I thought we took this off the phone." And they would say, "We did." And the funny thing from the Chinese perspective is, although they took the design by Apple in California off the phone, the black market phones, nobody would buy those phones because they believed that Apple's such an arrogant company that they always said designed by Apple in California. And so they needed to put that on there anyway, even though it was a fake phone, just to convince people it was real. So the fake phones sold better than the real phones at that point, which I just thought was kind of funny. But again, we see so many innovative things happening. The Shenzhen Electronics Group, and so imitation happens, but then so does scaling and refining and innovating. And so, here we see like these knockoff phones, and on the other end of the spectrum, we see a country that's leading the world in renewable energy and in solar panels and in so many different areas and ways. And so it's really a dramatic period. And here again, if you think about people like Li Keqiang, so this is not just about Xi Jinping, it's about the Li Keqiangs and the Justin Lins of the world. They've been talking about things like entrepreneurship and innovation for more than a decade. And this is really important to China because this isn't just a deep, cheap labor pool. This is a place where the best innovations are happening in the world. And so it's beyond Shanghai to B2C services. We see the just dramatic transformation of the bike share industry. It all happened in China. The apps for riding scans, bike share and car share, Lyft and Uber, they had their inspiration in China. And so Shanghai is, China's not a copycat economy. It's beyond from copying to creating their own. Famous companies like Huawei, which I got to know very well at about a decade and a half ago. Just an amazing company that really is truly an innovative private company. You know, we used to just be a switching manufacturer and develop switching technology. But it was such an amazing thing to see the story of both with Face ID. Huawei came out with Face ID very quickly when Apple had come out with this, and Apple thought it was protecting that intellectual property so extremely, but Huawei figured it out. They had a different algorithm. It wasn't a hardware solution; it was a software solution, but it worked. And it was also fascinating. I thought, you know, we've decided not to sell Huawei chips. And, you know, probably we've pushed that company to be innovative because they've figured out their own chip manufacturing technology. And of course, they announced the launch of the Mate 60 Pro on the day that Gino Raimondo got to China, which I thought was, my team and I thought was a very interesting statement about how they feel about things. And then we see companies like Xiaomi. Xiaomi is a really interesting company because, again, it's often viewed as a knockoff brand. Their phones can't compete with Apple phones. But, you know, Apple had a product called Titan, which was supposed to be the Apple Car, and it was supposed to link with the Apple phone and all of those things. But you know, Xiaomi is the one that's coming out with the car before Apple is, and so we see a lot of different products that are moving across segments and sectors. And you know, China leads the world in things like solar tech, and so it's a really interesting and fascinating. These are big projects, things like big innovation projects like the Shanghai Institute of Microsystems and Information Technology. Fascinating developments in terms of the innovation that's happening in China. And you can see this across the board. And again, my group, we do research on different cities, and we've written about Hangzhou as a smart city, Zhengzhou, the story of economic development, the Suzhou Industrial Park. And we encourage you to go look at the work that we're doing in those areas. We also believe that the future is about collaborative innovation. We think a Cold War, an economic Cold War, is not going to be helpful to anybody. And so what we want to see is continue to develop economic ties. And this brings us back to Phoenix. I think Phoenix is in a fascinating place to be the center of economic development in U.S. China relations. Phoenix is a fascinating place. Uh, the rise of Phoenix over the last decade, you know, Phoenix was sort of a sleepy desert town a decade or so ago, and now it's the fastest growing city in America, the fifth largest economy in America, the fifth largest city demographically. Arizona State has become, in my opinion, one of the most important universities and most important innovative universities in the world. Michael Crow is, in my opinion, the most important university president in the world right now. And so it's just a fascinating place. And because TSMC has has committed to coming to the Phoenix area, it creates a very interesting ground zero for U.S.-China relations and very important things like fab sites and the building of a manufacturing supply chain and how that conversation is going to play out. And here again, I would like to just emphasize, you know, my group has done economic development strategy. We did a deep 5-year economic development strategic plan for the District of Columbia, and we rolled that out. And about 5 years into it, we rolled it out in 2012, and looking into it in 2018, the numbers were all great. And so we, you know, of course, people like Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, Victor Hoskins, were really to be credited much more than we were, but we were there for the discussion and for the analysis, and we're very proud of that work. But we want to continue to do that kind of work, and we want to do it now for Phoenix. And the building of these fab sites and the thinking about U.S.-China relations is critical. And it makes Phoenix the center of a conversation that's really, really important right now. And the final thing that I'll say is it's important to take that position and not just be a position of economic development, but be a position of geopolitical conversations. So, you know, when San Francisco hosted the APEC meetings, it was very important that President Xi got on a plane and flew to San Francisco and met with President Biden. And it made APEC and San Francisco the center of that conversation. And we believe that should happen with Phoenix too. What does it mean that TSMC is there? And what does it mean that some people are saying it's a hedge against China? We think it should be an open door for conversation. But here again, we would argue that this isn't just about a city in the desert. This is about Phoenix as a center of geopolitical conversation and the center point of really important discussions in the world. And we think sister city relationships, Phoenix's sister cities with Chengdu, um, uh, Tempe's sister city is with Zhenjiang, and we've been developing work in our company with those kinds of relationships. ASU is there. The Thunderbird School of Global Management is there. I have in the bottom left a picture of Justin Lin because he's an old friend of mine. And when I was working for Apple and we were having some problems, I thought I'll call my friend Justin. I got to know him when I was the dean at George Washington University, and he came to give some speeches for me. And I thought he was just a brilliant economist. Um, Justin's famous because he's this story. His name is Lin Fu, and he has a famous story of having jumped in after he graduated from high school and did his army term in Taiwan. He jumped in the Taiwan Strait and swam across because he wanted to be in his homeland. He wanted to be in China, and he got out and was in China, and he went to study at Tsinghua University and became a brilliant economist, and eventually rose to being the chief economist of the World Bank. And we all thought he was going to be the head of the World Bank, but he left. He retired from his World Bank work and went back to China and became a professor at Beida. And so I was trying to figure out what to do with Apple's situation in China because I was getting more and more worried. And so I thought I'll call my old friend Justin. And so I emailed him and went to see him. And amazingly, Justin said, "Well, Doug, I appreciate you and I trust you and I appreciate your work. And in my meeting with President Xi tomorrow, I'll bring this up." And I said, "Wait, what?" He's like, "Well, I mean, I'm an economist at Beida, and President Xi has weekly one-on-ones with some of us, and so I'm one of them." And I was sort of stunned, but it reminded me that economic development isn't only about senior politics. It's about knowing people at lower levels who are people like Justin Lin. And again, I got to know him when I was dean at GW, and he's a fabulous economist who's very influential. So my key takeaways from this discussion, sorry it was so long, but I think these are important parts. First of all, the political culture of economic innovation. This is how China rose. China didn't rise because of rapid privatization, and it didn't rise because it's still a centrally planned economy. It does have 5-year plans that come out of Beijing, but those 5-year plans really are driven by local innovation, local governments as industrial firms. The third point is I want to remind people that Phoenix should be the center of U.S. China relations right now. It is a fascinating moment for this city. And it's a wonderful moment to really think deeply, not just about how do we make money and how do we attract investment in EB-5 money or H-1B visas, but instead, how do we learn from China and grow together? And how do we further build sister city relationships? How do we coordinate closely with ASU and China? ASU is the 5th university in the world to gain independent degree granting status in China. And this is a really interesting time for thinking about just how important these relationships are in terms of economic development, but also intellectually. How do we formalize trade relations with China, engage with the Arizona Commerce Authority? And then let's go a step below. Let's invite people like Justin Lin to Phoenix and think about what those relationships might mean, because those are how you foster deep intellectual and economic development relationships. So let me stop there. And I want to thank you all for listening, and hopefully this was useful. And we'll look forward to the next time that we might engage with you about topics that are really near and dear to our heart, which are about economic development in China and the ways in which U.S. China relations play a key role in thinking through the geopolitical landscape. So thank you very much, and more soon.